Sophie had been looking forward to this day for weeks. She barely slept the night before, filled with excitement and nervousness. Early in the morning, her mother called her from downstairs. "Sophie, wake up. It's time to go. We don't want to miss the train." Sophie quickly got dressed, feeling the butterflies in her stomach. She wasn't going to eat breakfast. She was too anxious. Today was the day she was going to visit her grandmother in the city, and for the first time, she was going alone on the train. Sophie and her mother left their house, walking towards the train station. It was a bit of a walk, but Sophie didn't mind. She was too busy thinking about the adventure ahead. When they arrived at the station, it was still early and not many people were there. Soon, the train arrived and it was nearly empty. Sophie climbed aboard, feeling both excited and a little scared. This was her first trip alone, and the thought of being so far from home made her nervous. "Remember, your grandmother will meet you in the city," her mother said, trying to reassure her. "Stay safe, Sophie. Don't talk to strangers, okay?" Sophie nodded, clutching her bag tightly. As the train started, Sophie glanced out of the window. She watched as her mother became smaller and smaller in the distance. Then the train began to pick up speed. The fields, trees, and towns blurred past her, and Sophie felt a little dizzy from the fast movement. After a while, she started to feel sleepy. It had been a long, exciting morning, and her eyes grew heavy. Slowly, she drifted off to sleep. When Sophie woke up, it was dark outside. She sat up quickly, startled, and looked around. She was alone in the carriage now, with no one else in sight. Her heart raced. The train was much quieter, and it felt strange to be in such an empty space. She heard the sound of footsteps coming from the other end of the carriage, and a tall man appeared. The man smiled at Sophie, his smile making her feel uneasy. "Hello," he said. "You're awake now, are you? Where are you headed?" Sophie remembered her mother's warning. She didn't speak, just looked at the man with caution. "Are you going to the city?" he asked again. Sophie shook her head, not trusting the stranger. "No, I'm going to visit my grandmother," she said quietly. "Ah, your grandmother," the man said with a grin, but his tone was strange. "We passed the city hours ago," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. Sophie felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "We passed the city." "Yes," the man replied. "You were asleep, but we passed it a long time ago." Sophie's heart sank. She had no idea where she was, and now the man seemed to know she was lost. Sophie felt her throat tighten. She remembered that her grandmother was supposed to meet her at the station, but now she had no idea where the train was taking her. The man noticed her distress and stepped closer. "Don't worry," he said, his voice softer now. "I'll help you. My name's Marcus. You can trust me." Sophie stared at Marcus, unsure whether he was trying to help or trick her. He was large, and his presence made her feel even more small and alone. The train began to slow down, and Marcus stood up. "We're coming into the next stop now. I'll help you get off," he said, and Sophie had no choice but to follow him. The train came to a stop, and Sophie quickly stood up, ready to escape. But the door to the train wouldn't open. Marcus moved in front of her, smiling. "Let me help you with that," he said, and he easily opened the door. Sophie stepped out onto the platform, her heart racing. She had no idea where she was or how to get back to the city. Marcus called a taxi and told Sophie to get in. She was hesitant, but didn't see any other option. As the taxi drove through the streets, Sophie noticed that the city was much larger and busier than she had imagined. She felt completely out of place. The taxi stopped in front of a large building. "Come on," Marcus said, his voice gentle now. "We'll get something to eat, and then I'll help you get back on track." Sophie stepped out of the taxi, but her unease only grew. She followed Marcus into the building, which seemed like a hotel. Inside, the lobby was dark and smelled of cigarettes. Two men were sitting at a table, talking and laughing. When they saw Marcus, they grinned. "Oh, Marcus, good to see you," one of the men said. "Who's the girl?" "This is Sophie," Marcus introduced her. "She's lost, but I'll take care of her." Sophie could feel their eyes on her, and she started to feel even more uncomfortable. They gave her a drink, but Sophie didn't touch it. She didn't trust them, and she was afraid of what might happen next. Eventually, Marcus took her upstairs to her room. "You're safe here," he said with a smile, locking the door behind him. Sophie sat on the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to find a way out. Later, Sophie had an idea. She found a pen and wrote a note asking for help. She threw it out the window, hoping someone would find it. To her relief, a man outside picked it up and smiled at her before disappearing. But when the door opened, it wasn't a police officer or someone to help her. It was Marcus holding her note. Sophie's heart sank. She had no way out. Marcus didn't seem angry. Instead, he just smiled. "You're safe with me," he said, his smile now feeling more like a trap. Sophie didn't know what to think anymore. She didn't trust him, but she didn't have anywhere to go. The next day, Marcus took her to a big building. Sophie was confused until she saw a sign. The city championship boxing match. Marcus the fighter versus Danny the tiger. Sophie realized Marcus was a boxer. The man she had feared was actually a famous athlete. That it was a strange mix of emotions for Sophie. She had been so afraid, but now she understood that Marcus wasn't a criminal. After the match, Marcus drove Sophie to her grandmother's house. As they arrived, Sophie's grandmother greeted her with open arms. "Thank goodness you're safe," her grandmother exclaimed, giving her a warm hug. Sophie smiled, feeling relief and a little embarrassed about her fears. "Thank you, Marcus," Sophie said quietly. "No problem," he replied with a smile. "Take care, Sophie. I'm glad everything worked out." And with that, Sophie stepped into her grandmother's house, her heart finally at ease. Sophie walked into her grandmother's house, her heart still racing from the events of the past few days. She had never imagined that her journey would turn out like this. Her grandmother, who had been waiting anxiously, wrapped her in a warm hug, and for a moment, Sophie felt safe and loved. "Oh, Sophie, I was so worried when I heard you were late." "What happened?" her grandmother asked, her voice filled with concern. Sophie hesitated for a moment, thinking about the strange journey she had just experienced. She wasn't sure how to explain the fear she had felt when she first met Marcus, and how confused and lost she had been. But she knew one thing for sure. She was grateful to him for helping her get here, even if she still didn't fully understand everything about him. "It's a long story, Grandma," Sophie said, sitting down on the old armchair by the fireplace. "But I'm okay now. I met a man named Marcus on the train. At first, I thought he was dangerous, but he wasn't. He helped me get to you, and now I'm here." Her grandmother listened carefully, nodding as she sipped her tea. "I see. You were frightened, but you're safe now. I'm glad that man helped you." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "But I think you need to be more careful next time, Sophie. You never know who you can trust, and sometimes things aren't always as they seem." Sophie nodded. "I know, Grandma. I was scared, but Marcus wasn't bad. He's a boxer. Actually, I think he's famous, but he didn't look like the kind of person you'd expect to be famous. I didn't understand him at first, but now I do." Her grandmother gave her a gentle smile. "It's good that you've learned something from this. People aren't always what they appear to be at first, but you should always trust your instincts. And if you ever feel uncertain again, don't hesitate to reach out for help." Sophie smiled back, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in days, she felt like she was truly home. Her grandmother's house was warm, filled with the smells of fresh bread baking in the oven and the sounds of soft music playing in the background. It felt so different from the chaos and uncertainty she had experienced during her journey. As the evening wore on, Sophie and her grandmother talked for hours. Her grandmother told her stories of her own childhood, of times when she had traveled alone, and of the lessons she had learned along the way. Sophie listened intently, grateful for the wisdom and love her grandmother always offered. Later that night, when it was time for bed, Sophie couldn't help but reflect on the strange adventure that had brought her here. Despite her fears, she had made it to her grandmother's house safely. She had learned important lessons about trust, courage, and resilience. She had also learned that sometimes, even in the most unexpected circumstances, people could surprise you in ways you never expected. That as Sophie lay in bed that night, she thought about Marcus. She didn't know what would happen to him, but she hoped that he would be okay too. She knew that people, no matter how tough or intimidating they seemed, could always change. And perhaps Marcus would find his own path to peace, just like she had found her way back to her grandmother. With those thoughts in her mind, Sophie drifted off to sleep, feeling safe and content, ready for the new day ahead. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast, Sophie's grandmother suggested they take a walk around the village. Sophie agreed, eager to enjoy the fresh air and take in the beauty of the countryside. The village was small, but there was something peaceful about it. The streets lined with old stone houses, the gentle hum of the river nearby, and the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. As they walked along the path, Sophie's grandmother spoke about the history of the village, the people who lived there, and the changes that had happened over the years. Sophie felt comforted by her grandmother's voice, the steady rhythm of her words, and the peaceful surroundings. "Sometimes, Sophie," her grandmother said thoughtfully, "you have to trust that everything happens for a reason. Even when things seem difficult or confusing at first, they always seem to make sense in the end. You'll see, you've learned a lot already, and your journey is just beginning." Sophie smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She was glad to be here, safe and sound. Her grandmother had always been a beacon of wisdom and strength in her life. And now, more than ever, Sophie realized how important it was to have people who cared about you, no matter where you were or what you were going through. As they walked back to the house, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle within her. Her journey had been unexpected, but she had learned something valuable along the way. Life might be uncertain at times, but with the right people and the right heart, everything would eventually work out. And as she stepped back into the warm embrace of her grandmother's house, Sophie felt ready for whatever came next in her life, knowing that she would face it with courage, trust, and the support of the people who loved her.